So hello, everybody. This is Debbie Powell, Master Gardener Coordinator for Calaveras and Tuolumne County. We are having our first virtual Open Garden Day presentation for the year for 2021. We're here during COVID, so we're doing everything virtual right at the moment. But I want to present to you our Tuolumne Master Gardener, Al Dahlstrand, who's got such a great amount of information. You're going to love to ask him questions, but do it by chat. Okay, Al.
Okay. Well, we'll start out. I want to start out by first saying that fruit trees should be pruned every year. Towards the end of this discussion and the slides that will show, I'll show you a couple of fruit trees that weren't pruned every year and how out of control they can get. In fact, the fruit tree that's on the lead slide is one of them that's been up at the garden for years. It's a cherry tree that got out of control, and it's a lot of work to get these back into control. So they should be pruned every year. If you're interested in the fruit, obviously, fruit trees should be pruned every year to enhance the fruiting of the wood. You can prune to control the shape and the size of the tree. And you also prune to get rid of the dead wood and the diseased wood, which really helps the health of the tree as well. And then one of the other main advantages of pruning every year is to increase the circulation and the sunlight penetration into the tree to make sure you get better growth as time goes on. Now, we also, as far as pruning is concerned, as far as cutting out all the dead and diseased wood, we also cut out the suckers along the base of the tree that come up from the root system or around the trunk. And we also cut out the water sprouts that come off the branches in various areas that take a lot of energy out of the tree, use a lot of water, rather than we want all that water and all that energy going into the fruit production instead, and the growth of the tree. And the other thing we need to know too about fruit tree production is we've got two basic kinds of systems. I have a couple of different kinds of pruning systems in my yard. We also have the same thing up at the demonstration garden. Most of the younger trees we train into an open center type system where the center of the tree is opened up kind of like a wide wine glass so that the air circulation and the sunlight can get into the middle of the tree to really help the growth of the fruit. The other type of pruning system is kind of a central leader system. You let the center stem come up through the tree, and then everything comes off the center stem. Sometimes we use kind of a modification of those two systems. But the other thing we need to know for fruit tree pruning is, depending on the tree and depending on the type of tree, is where does the fruit basically grow from on the tree. For example, apricots and other stone fruits like peaches and nectarines and plums, most of the fruit comes on some on 1 year growth, the first year growth, but most of the fruit comes on the 2-year and older spurs that are joined that are growing on the tree. Trees like apples and pears, some fruit is produced on the 1-year shoots, but most of the fruit is on 2-year and older spurs that develop. And we'll show you some examples of spurs rather than just the simple bud that's going to develop on new wood. Pardon me, is there a question?
Yeah, there's a couple. The first one from April says, I have new seedlings, apple, plum, and peach that have been planted less than a year and have not produced fruit yet. Is there any initial time frame you should wait?
Actually, they'll probably start producing buds and blossom probably the second year at least. And you'll get, oftentimes in the second or third year, you'll get fruit.
And then I think, let's see, we've got another one that says, I have a pomegranate tree apricot, tree avocado, and Meyer lemons about 40 feet tall, no blooms. And she says they're in containers because they have no dirt and they've been on her porch for the past few years. Is it time to transplant to a larger container and move outside? Oh,
Yes, I would say your fruiting production off of trees in small containers is really limited. So it's time to get them in the ground where they can really flourish.
she has
And
concrete for dirt, it sounds like.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Get them in some good soil. Get them in the ground where they can get going.
Okay, I trimmed my sour tangerine this week. It went from a bush to a tree. Any suggestions on making it healthy and produce a ton of fruit? Last year I had a bumper crop. I worry about its health.
Sometimes the fruit trees will have a down year or two. For example, we've got an old apple tree that's probably over 40 years old, 45 years old maybe. That was here before we moved into the house. And that apple, for example, in 2020 produced very little fruit. And the fruit it did produce wasn't really diseased that much. We had a codling moth problem for years, but it wasn't really diseased that much. So I don't think that was the problem, but I think it was just a down year. And it could have been some weather factors as well. However, in 2019, we had a bumper crop. We've never had that many apples on it before, and it was really healthy, and there was very little disease on it as well. So sometimes the fruit production will change drastically, and there's really not a clear answer as to why. So sometimes it's a good year, sometimes it's a terrible year, and we've seen the same thing with the fruit trees up at the garden from time to time as well. So.
Okay, let's see. Debbie, is this recording going to be available online?
Yes.
Okay. And Marilyn, we're going to be talking about grapes next month, if you don't mind joining us for Open Garden Day next month. Then I have Barbara, who says she has peach trees and one cherry tree. How do you keep the deer away? And what do I need to feed them to help them better produce?
Well, you got to keep the deer away. Put a pyre fence in, fence them out. That's the only thing you can do, because if they get in there and start eating the tree, they're going to be breaking all the smaller fruiting wood and the new growth off the tree, because that's the tender succulent stuff that they like to eat. So new growth is going to be tough on the trees if you don't keep the deer out.
And should she feed them anything special?
Feed the deer? Feed the trees anything special?
Yeah, not the deer.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. We usually give our fruit trees, some fertilizer every year. Occasionally I miss a year, but fertilize. It's good to fertilize every year, probably in the late winter, I would say, probably in March.
What is your fertilizer focused on, potassium or phosphorus or?
No, I'd say the fertilizer, most of it would probably be based on a little higher nitrogen than the potassium and phosphorus, because in a lot of the foothill soils, there's enough potassium and phosphorus for the fruit trees to handle a lot of the native soil. So I'd concentrate, but I wouldn't focus on a real high nitrogen fertilizer. A general fertilizer that we've used at the garden in the past has been a 6-16, but that's usually too high on the potassium and phosphorus. I concentrate more on like a 10, 4, and 4 is what I use. Yeah. But,
okay, here, I'm sorry, we're still got more questions. I have 2 bare root trees, peach and cherry. Do I prune when I plant? I know that answer.
Yeah, you do prune when you plant. We'll talk about bare roots maybe at the end, but let's go through the slides for the young fruit trees first.
Okay.
And then we'll talk a little bit about bare roots at the end too.
Okay, well, I'll ask these 9 more questions in a little bit. We'll let you get going and everybody, and then I'll come back to your questions.
Cool. Okay, this first slide is just a typical pruning tools. Pole pruner on the top. Sometimes these pole pruners have a saw blade like the second tool with the old axe handle. But I usually take the saws off my pole pruners because they get tangled in the branches more. It makes it really hard to prune. And then right in the middle, we see a hand pruner and a longer lopper. They're both anvil type pruners where you have one blade coming down on a real sharp blade coming down on an anvil. They're handy in certain circumstances. The bottom two, both the hand pruner and the lopper, those are bypass pruners, and those two pruners are probably ones that I use most often because they, as long as you keep them sharp, they give a nice clean cut. And then I've got a little trim saw, folding trim saw on the left-hand side. And then at the garden 2 years ago, I don't think we use them very often, but we do have a couple of steel mesh gloves to use because I know over the years I've come very close to snipping the tips of my fingers off when I'm pruning. And if you're not used to pruning, or you tend to not have good coordination sometimes, it's probably not a bad idea to have your free hand with a mesh glove on it. Second slide, Debbie. Okay, this slide's at my house. It just shows a couple of different kinds of ladders. When we first moved in, we had a number of fruit trees, and it's the lawn area around the fruit trees is a very uneven surface. And the only two ladders I had were a 6-foot ladder that's in the middle, and I had a 10-foot step ladder also, and they're very precarious on an uneven surface. So I invested a couple $100 into a 10-foot orchard ladder, and that's what I use right now exclusively, and it's very stable. And it allows me to get up into most of my trees. And hopefully, if you're planting a lot of new fruit trees, you don't let them get too tall, so you may not need a 10-foot ladder. You may be able to get away with an orchard ladder that's 6 or 7 foot in height. The tree right between the ladders happens to be an old cherry that we used to have. And that cherry, I'll mention, is a central leader type system. That was never pruned to have branches going off in a bowl type shape. But that cherry was very successful for years, but you can see a dark area right in the middle of the leaders on the cherry that disease developed in there, and I had to wrap them and to try and minimize the water getting in there and the disease getting in there. But the cherry finally, after it got to be about 35 years old, we finally had to take it out and replace it. Next slide. Okay, this is an example of a pear that we used to have. It was taken out after a while because it finally got so involved, so consumed by fire blight. But this is a typical example of a pear, and this also can be applicable to apples. It shows the terminal buds on the new growth up to the upper right. And then as you go back down the branch, you see spurs developing from last year's wood. And then on the left-hand side, you can see more complicated spurs developing. And that's where these spurs, that's where most of the fruit on the pears and the apples will develop. You'll get some development on the current year growth on the tips of the branches, but typically I cut the tips of those branches after they're bloomed, and to actually keep the fruit off. Or if I don't prune those tips back right away, I'll take the fruit off if fruit develops on it, because the tips of the branches aren't strong enough to really hold the fruit. Next slide. Okay, this is a pear again, but this can also be applicable to just about any fruit tree, but this is a typical pruning cut above a bud. And we do this not only on longer branches to take off a third to maybe a half of the fruiting wood so that it just doesn't get real stocky and grow tall. But this type of cut is also used if we want that branch to grow sideways off to the side in the direction of the bud. So if there's a vacant area where you want that branch to develop, pick a nice healthy bud like this photo shows, and just do a steep diagonal cut just above the bud, about a quarter to half an inch above the bud. And then that bud will develop into a new branch going off to the upper right. So that's a technique that we use to fill vacant areas in all these fruit trees to make them grow in certain directions. Next slide. This is happens to be my apple tree. And that apple tree, like I said, in 2019 produced a bumper crop, and it's a very busy tree. You can see a number of things that have been done to this tree. First of all, the branch going off to the right-hand side, you can see where a major branch was pruned off on that tree years ago. The upper part of the trunk and the upper part of that first branch to the right, you can see a lot of woodpecker holes. And the woodpeckers can basically kill a fruit tree in very little time. And but this tree, the woodpeckers haven't completely interrupted the flow in the cambium layer between the leaves and the fruit. So it's still a reasonably good fruit producer. This tree also shows right in the center of the picture on coming off of the major branches, you can see some water sprouts coming off of those major branches, and those are areas where I just cut those water sprouts out completely, unless there's a vacant spot that needs to be filled in where maybe a dead or diseased branch was cut out. Sometimes I'll use a water sprout coming off of a branch to start filling that area. And then you train it to fill that area, grow into that area by picking selective buds to make branches grow into those vacant areas of the tree. Next slide. I might add too on that last slide, seeing those woodpecker holes. About 4 or 5 years ago, we took out an almond tree that was completely girdled with the upper branches by woodpeckers, and the upper branches just completely died, so we had to take it out. So woodpeckers can be, they can be as bad as diseases of various kinds. Now this shows pear again, and this is a very busy tree. And what I had to do every year was prune out all the fire blight. You can see one new branch right in the center upper part where it goes from. It grows from a nice shiny new growth type of reddish area into a brown or blackish area. And that's a branch that's got fire blight on it. And those have to be taken out right away as soon as you see it. Because the fire blight can spread like wildfire. It's just
yeah. And you got to wash your pruning instruments in between each cut. If you go to another tree, right?
Yeah. Especially if you've been cutting through the fire blight branches. What I try and do is cut below the fire blight and take the whole branch out if I can. And then I don't have to clean my tools quite as much. But Lisa's right. If you get into fire blight or diseased branches of any kind, it's best to just have a 10% bleach solution or something like that to dip your tools in and wipe them off. But and this tree has also a lot of crossing branches. Anytime branches are interfering with each other, they can get damaged when the wind blows and they're rubbing against each other. It also gets so crowded in the tree that it hampers the fruit production, air circulation, the sun can't get in. So there are all kinds of reasons why it's nice to simplify the mass of branches that you've got in a tree. Next slide. Okay, this is out in Lori Daniels' yard. She was a master gardener that was with us for a number of years before she moved. But she had a fairly young orchard. I'd say the oldest tree in the orchard was probably 5 or 6 years old. But so we went out and we had her pruning, and then we were talking about what needed to be pruned. So all of these slides will show the activity of actually pruning different branches off, and we'll talk about the reasons.
So,
But this is the first pruning of a 2-year-old pear.
so do you wait till they're 2 years old to prune them?
No,
Yeah.
we prune from the start. From if you have a bare
Planting.
root and you put the bare root into the ground, you prune it right away. And then you prune it every year after that
Oh, okay.
to basically get the structure to grow. Now this pear actually was pruned before, because you can see it's got a nice symmetrical structure to the branches coming off. You see about 3 major structural branches coming off right at the top of the trunk. So it's already developing a nice shape. And all we're going to do is prune it, but you can see the height. I noticed one question just popped up on when to prune apricots, or to wait till after the rainy season.
Right. Well, usually
then-
apricots are summer, aren't they?
Well, apricots, I actually prune that in the fall, but I prune it before all the leaves come off, because apricots are typically very susceptible to what do they call it, dieback. You tip a dieback, and I've had a lot of branches die back on my apricot, and the healthiest time to prune it is when the leaves are still on it. Although it's harder to see sometimes about where you want to prune branches out, because the leaves tend to mask a lot of the areas. But they also recommend in pruning apricots that you, between every cut, because you tip a dieback can take hold on the tree so easily, that you, between every cut, that you basically sterilize your pruners.
Okay.
And that can be a real pain, but it's necessary.
So how would you describe what a bare root tree is to somebody that doesn't know, Al?
Well, a bare root tree, you buy it and it's not in any soil. It's all you see are the bare roots and the trunk and a few branches, and it typically comes wrapped up in a sawdust type soil or a peat type soil in a bag. And maybe we'll talk about bare roots right now while we're okay. Again, we're back to this first pruning of this 2-year-old pear. Like I said, you can see it has a pretty nice structure. Let's go to the next slide, Debbie. Okay, now this is the same pear, and what's happening here is she's pruning off some of the sucker growth coming out of the root system or the bottom of the trunk right at the ground, because that basically takes a lot of energy away from the tree and needs to come out. Next slide.
Okay.
And now she's taking off some dead and some diseased wood on this little pear. And you can see it's a pretty simple tree. It's very young. Next slide. And now she's opening up the center of the tree. She's cutting back the main branch going right up the center of the tree, and this will open up the whole tree to get, as it grows more branches and more leaves, it'll get a lot better circulation and light.
So you want to have a central leader going up, basically.
Yeah, we're going to cut off the central leader, and we're going to concentrate on developing the branches off to the side to give kind of a steep sloping glass shape to it.
Okay.
Next slide. Okay, now she's pruning the interior branches to open up more. You can still see the main 3 branches are still there. Tree is developing a nice structure to it, but she's just taking these branches out that will interfere with other branches in the center. Next slide. Now she's taking about 1/3 of the growth off the top, and she's cutting it above a bud on each one, so that'll promote branching off of the major structural branches. So it'll start getting to be a little bit more complicated branching arrangement on the tree. Next slide. And this is the completed pruning. So you can see those 4 structural branches are, nicely spaced, and it's nice and simple. And what needs to happen to a young tree like this too is it needs to be whitewashed, the whole trunk. needs to be whitewashed so it protects it from the sun. Typical whitewash that we use is a 50% interior latex, white latex, mixed with water, and just paint it on. And when it kind of starts fading, you can see the bigger trees in the background were already whitewashed in those areas. Next slide. Okay, this is a 3 to 4 year old peach prior to pruning, and it doesn't look like it's ever been pruned. And so you can tell it's pretty complicated. You can see the couple of main branches coming off just one 6 inches above the ground, the other one maybe a foot or so above the ground. And the tree is just really a kind of a tangled mess. So we launched into that. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, first task was to be taken off these lower branches that are real close to the ground so that the tree can be concentrated on growing main structural branches farther up the trunk. So she's cutting off one of the first couple of main branches. Next slide. Now she's cutting off another branch right down in the same area. And you'll be amazed at about 10 slides down the road here, how good the tree will look. Okay, next slide. Now she's cutting off some small branches that are competing with other structural branches. The branches right down where her two gloved hands are, that's where those main branches are what she's gonna develop as the main structural branches for the tree. So she's cutting off one of the smaller branches that's competing with those. Next slide. And now she's cutting off some water sprouts. You can see coming off right where her trimmer is, the new wood that's kind of a reddish color. And most of the water sprouts on these trees should be cut off because they take a lot of energy out of the tree. But in certain times, like I think I explained with my apple, I've left a water sprout or two in if there's a vacant spot in the tree that needs to be filled in. Like if I lost a branch due to disease or due to just dying off or an injury or something, I'll take that branch out and then I'll use a water sprout to that might develop on a neighboring branch to fill that area.
It won't get fruit though, right?
It will get fruit, yeah. The water sprout will develop fruit, but generally the water sprout is weaker wood also than the main structure. It's not quite as strong a wood, but you can train a water sprout just by cutting above a directional bud. You can train that water sprout to grow into a vacant area, and it will develop some fruit, but it's a weaker branch.
Okay.
Now she's cutting off the central leader to open up the center of the tree, and that'll improve the circulation and the light penetration into the tree. Next slide. Now you can see that central leader is gone, and now she's going out and she's pruning a third to half of the new growth where the fruit will grow on this peach and develop new wood going in different directions. Next slide. And now they're pruning interior crossing branches to open up the center of the tree. You can see between Jack and between the two of them, you can see a lot of crossing branches in there. So they're going to open up that. Okay, next slide. Now she's pruning the lower structural branch on a bud, outward facing bud to fill a void area. So that structural branch is going to grow a new branch and start filling either into a void or filling more outward. Next slide. And now she's pruning a secondary branch above the outward facing bud. And you note that she's got a glove on one hand and a mesh glove on the other hand. So that's a good safety tool to use. I don't know where you can get mesh gloves around here, but we had to order those, I think, for the garden. Next slide. And now she's cutting out the competing vertical branch. You can see just above her left hand, there's two branches going vertically. She's cutting out one of those. Next slide, Debbie. And now she's pruning 1/4 to half off the new top growth. You can see that top growth has some lateral branches growing out of it too, but it's getting to the point where it's so tall that it's going to be, in a couple more years, it's going to be out of control, and then you're going to need a ladder to start picking any fruit off of it. So the idea, especially with us as we age, we try and keep our trees a little bit smaller so we spend less time up off of a 10-foot ladder trying to pick fruit or prune.
Yeah.
So next slide, Debbie. And now she's pruning off another interior branch, competing interior structural branch, just to make it opened up more. Next slide. And she's pruning 1/4 to half of the new top growth off again on another branch. Next slide. And this is the completion of the peach. Now, if you remember back about 13 or 14 slides, that tree seemed really complicated. Now look at how nice and open it looks now. And it's got a chance to really start growing laterally and really develop good fruiting wood. So it's a big difference when you take a complicated tree like that and do a proper pruning job on it. Makes it much healthier and produce more fruit. Okay, next slide, Debbie. Okay, this is a nectarine, and she's pruning off a diseased major structural branch. On this one, you can see how dark it is. It's basically dead. So she's pruning that off. Next slide. And now she's taking a water sprout, you can see, that's coming off the lower part of the trunk on the left. And she's going to train that water sprout to replace that diseased structural branch. And I think we made a note here, the remainder of the tree is to be completed by the owner. So these were the major things that we had to get done to this tree right away. And the rest of it will be pruned similar to the
Peach tree.
peach that we just showed.
Yeah.
Okay, and that looks like on this trunk also it needs a re-whitewashing in the bottom too, because they tend to fade after a couple of years. Next slide, Debbie. This is a 3-year-old pear that's never been pruned,
Ah,
and you can see what a tangle it is.
a lot of work.
Oh boy, it's basically got a nice shape to it though, but you can see the structural branches just about the level of her hip, just above her knee. It's developed a nice shape generally, but it's so busy it needs to be cleaned out. So she's removing the main central leader to open up the middle of the tree, and the branches, structural branches just below that area are really nicely shaped. Next slide. And now she's removing a major structural leader to open up the tree even more. And we'll see the results of that in a minute as well. I think the leader that she's removing is kind of just above her left arm, to the left of her elbow.
Ah,
Next slide, Debbie. Okay, and she's removing a final structural central leader, and the remainder of the tree will be pruned by her, leaving about 2/3 of the new growth and the older fruiting spurs. So the center of this tree was the real target when we pruned this one. Open up the whole thing, and then she can trim those tall leaders or the tall shoots off the top of the tree that are all new wood. Prune about 1/2 to 2/3 off of that. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is now we're over to Cassina Garden again, and this is a 4 to 5-year-old nectarine. It doesn't happen to be there anymore, but here about 10 years ago, this was what it looked like. And the structural pruning is completed. You can see the structural branches about midway up the tree have a nice shape and a nice structure to them. And what Jack's doing on this one is pruning the height to limit the height of those tall shoots. Next slide, please. And again, he's cutting out crossing and dead branches, anything that might be diseased. Looks like this tree is also getting some competition from the tree to the right, which I think was a peach. And those two trees often get tangled and we have to untangle them every year and limit the height on them. You can see how tall those sprouts are. Next slide. Okay, pruning again to limit height. He's got a 7-foot ladder there, and you can see how tall the tree's getting. So he's going to limit the height so we can safely and more easily pick the fruit before it does develop. Next slide. Okay, he's pruning off 1/4 to 1/3 of the new growth, and the fruit on this nectarine will grow on the remaining new growth left. On the tall branch that's in front of Jack, to the right of him, but is closest to the camera, you can see all those buds on forming on that new growth. And you can see there's a branch growing off the upper part of that. That'll probably be cut back also. But there's so many buds, nice healthy buds on that limb that you can prune just above one of those buds to get it to grow in any direction you want to grow in. So that's a tool that we use all the time. Next slide. Okay, pruning up down facing branch there. Branches that point down to the ground get in the way, often get broken off, and any fruit that are on them, sometimes if it's a small branch, it'll break off anyway. So we usually just get rid of the down facing branches. Next slide. Pruning off new growth again for fruit production and to limit the height. That's just part of the process, never-ending part of the process every year. You can see on the tree behind it too how tall those shoots are. That's in one of the trees at the garden that's been out of control for a long time, and we just get it back into control, and then the next year it grows huge sprouts like this again. So it's a constant yearly problem. Next slide. Okay, pruning off crossing branches again. They interfere with each other, and it's good just to get rid of them because they'll get damaged if you don't prune them off. Next slide. And she's pruning some down-facing branches again. Next slide. And pruning back about 1/3 of the new growth to help the fruit production come out of the middle part of the branch, which is where most of the fruit will come out. Next slide. And pruning off close and inward facing branches that tend to clog up the middle. If you can see those little branches going into the center of the tree. Trying to get rid of those so that most of the growth is concentrated in the areas on the outside of the bowl area of the tree where you want the fruit production. Next slide, please. Okay, this is an Asian pear, one of the 3 or 4 Asian pears we used to have at the garden. It's at this time it was a 20-plus-year-old tree.
Wow.
Probably by the time we took it out, it was probably 30 years old.
Yeah.
What would you say, Lisa?
Yeah, I would say.
And it's large size, and you can see we've already started cutting back on the main central leaders on the tree, and we had to keep on cutting about 3 feet off of these central leaders every year just to get this tree under control. And you can see the upper part of the tree that goes off out of the picture. All those are tall shoots that produce very little fruit, and they really do no good to the tree. So we're trying to get that thing cut down to a manageable size. This particular Asian pear is no longer there because these Asian pears were very susceptible to fire blight. And once that starts on the tree, it's really hard to control. So we had to take, I think, 2 of the major ones out.
Yeah.
I think we only have 1 left, don't we, Lisa?
Yeah, and then out of it to try to get the fire blight out of it last year.
Yeah, it's a real problem with these pears. Next slide, Debbie. And this is a plum on the back side of the garden. And this plum, from what I heard, was injured years ago when a small wildfire came down the backside of the hill, and it kind of singed the bottom of the trunk, and the the plum, or no, I'm sorry, that was the cherry. This plum wasn't hit by the fire. This is a Santa Rosa plum. And sometimes this Santa Rosa plum is a good producer too, but you can see that it's just totally out of control. And I think as far as the upward growth, that by the time we got a hold of it, it'd probably never been pruned. So
Wow.
it looks a lot different now.
That's why it's still so tall though, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's still pretty tall. We still have to prune it off a 10-foot ladder. Next slide, Debbie.
I think that's it, Al.
That's it. Okay.
That's it. Yeah.
I think there's one more slide though. Is there one more?
No, not on this. Yeah.
Oh, bummer. Because I've got one more slide on my version, and it shows a peach orchard down in the Central Valley where they cut off, where for some reason, from a production standpoint, it wasn't producing the quality of peaches that they liked. So, and the root systems were still fairly healthy. So all these peach trees in this orchard had 3 or 4 main structural leaders in the tree growing upward and outward. And they cut off all but one leader, and then they grafted new peach wood into the stubs that they just cut off to create new fruiting wood and new production. And I talked to the research outfit down in the Central Valley, and they said sometimes a grower will decide to take a whole orchard out because they don't like the production for some reason, or they aren't producing well. And rather than planting a new orchard and not getting any production for the first 6 or 7 years, sometimes they'll cut these leaders off and splice in and graft in new fruiting wood because they can get production out of those in 3 or 4 years.
That sounds like a lot of work though.
It was a lot of work, yeah. And but that's the last slide I had on my version of it. I'll have to email you that version.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll get to some questions that we didn't get before.
Yeah.
The chat box, by the way, Debbie, is disabled.
Oh,
somebody wants to know how about watering in winter? How often?
Well, it depends on the rainfall. If we have a dry stint of say more than 3 weeks, and good rainfall up to that point in time, I'll I'll turn on my drip system, or I'll actually take water out of my rainwater tanks, and I'll start distributing water to the fruit trees and all my plants really, as well as my winter vegetable garden. But in the past, I know 1 year recently, we've had total month of January was dry.
Right.
Another year, maybe the next year, the previous year, the total month of February was dry. And when it gets into February or March and you have long dry spells, then it's even more important to water those trees. Give them some water once a week. And
for good, slow, deep water, right?
Yeah. Yep. And a lot of times off my rainwater tank, I'll run a hose out there and just pump water on them so you get 20, 30 gallons of water on it and then move it to another tree.
Right.
But for sure, you want to make sure your fruit trees are well watered coming out of the winter and going into the spring, because if we have a dry spring, then your fruit tree runs the risk of basically dying in the heat of the summer if you have a late winter and a dry late winter and a dry spring.
Wow. Okay, this one is, we have a graft pear, Anjou Asian. Are they pruned the same? I think you answered that question, but by your slides.
Yeah.
You prune Asian pears the same as you prune other fruit trees, right?
Yeah. And I prune an Asian pear just the same as I prune another European pear.
Okay, where am I?
And hey, Lisa and Al, I've allowed our participants right now to unmute themselves.
Okay.
So I think we've got I think we're okay.
Hey,
Okay.
So,
this question is a little off topic, but how do you keep a woodpecker from pecking on your house?
I've never been able to succeed at that. I don't know. Shoot the darn thing. I don't know.
Okay,
But sometimes they'll peck. I know some woodpeckers will peck on the eaves on
right.
the boards just below the eaves of the house.
Hmm.
And if they're going in and developing a hole, what you need to do is put some screen on there. Just
Ah,
staple some screen up there to try and discourage them.
oh, okay.
He's
This one says
actually,
go
he's
ahead,
actually,
Debbie.
it's Barbara. He's actually pecking on the house itself.
Uh-huh, that's what,
Yeah.
good luck.
See if you can see if you can staple some window screen over it, something that he doesn't like to peck on. Even a closely spaced hardware cloth or something like that going to make it harder for him.
Okay, I have heard that apricots are not to be pruned until after the rainy season ends due to disease. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, that's what they recommend that pruning apricots. I prune apricots before the rainy season starts.
Same kind of
So-
idea, though.
So that, yeah, same idea. You prune it before the rainy season starts. That way the prunes or the fresh surfaces that you've just pruned off and created by pruning a branch off have time to kind of glaze over before the moisture hits. And it really cuts down on the Utipa dieback development.
Okay. I have a cherry, pear, and apple that are 40+ years old. I've been pruning them since I've been here 10 years, but they're still too tall. How much of the leaders and branches can I remove in 1 year?
We take at the garden when we were pruning these pears and the plum back, we would take about maximum 3 feet a year off of those.
Okay.
So basically, you get it down to a manageable size, because that top fruit, not everybody owns tall ladders, and it's dangerous to get up there to pick the fruit anyway. So having the tree being that tall is kind of a waste of energy and a waste of time.
Okay. What's the maximum amount of pruning you want to do on one tree? A half or a third?
It kind of depends on how tall the shoots are. If the shoots are really tall and really lengthy, like sometimes in 1 year, I'll get the tall shoots on the top of our Santa Rosa plum that are maybe 4 to 5 feet tall.
Right.
And if they're coming off the top of the tree and adding height that I don't want, I'll cut the whole leader off, all of it.
Okay.
But if I'm cutting lower branches that I want to develop fruit, then I'll limit it to anywhere from a third to half. I usually don't, the lower branches, I usually don't take more than half.
Okay. Do you prune a fig differently than other fruit trees?
A fig?
Yeah.
Actually, no. And sometimes the figs I'll prune a little more aggressively than other fruit trees because they tend to grow back so fast.
Yeah.
It's like that fig up at the garden. Sometimes we prune that in walkway areas and everything. We prune that 2 or 3 times a year. And the other thing I'm pruning too, if there's a lot of late spring or summer growth on a tree that you don't want, don't be afraid to prune it back. If
Okay.
it's in the way, prune it back.
Okay. This one says, on older trees, do you continue to leave a quarter of new growth every year? And if so, won't it grow too tall over time? If you cut off
Yeah.
all the new, if you cut off all the new growth on tall trees, will the tree die or not produce fruit anymore?
No, it'll produce fruit and it won't die. I've got that Santa Rosa plum of mine that's already too tall, but I've cut it back to a manageable size, and all the new shoots on top every year, I cut the new shoots off completely and don't let it get any taller, and it produces lots of fruit on the interior part of the tree.
Okay.
I've done the same thing to almonds. I've done the same thing to our apple tree.
Okay.
I've never let the peaches get any taller than I can easily reach off a small ladder. So that seems to work well.
Okay, I have a mandarin that's been grafted on a grapefruit, I think. The main tree hasn't produced. The mandarin just produced on fruit this last year. It's been in the ground for 3 years. Can I totally cut the main tree? I don't understand. April, are you there still? Maybe you can clarify.
Is Al here?
Yeah, yeah.
I was
Okay.
looking, I don't know if that question made sense, so I was asking.
It doesn't cut the main tree, but the other one was grafted onto it. But if you want to cut the grafted part off, yeah, cut the grafted part off the main tree if it hasn't worked out.
Oh, you understood it then. Okay. We have fire blight really bad. Should we remove all the trees?
Remove all the fire blight immediately, and make sure you get rid of the fire blight completely. Get it off your site completely. Don't leave it laying around on the ground, or the fire blight will continue to kind of hang around in the the trash or the leaf areas on the ground itself. So I would just get them off, get the fire blight part trimmed out and get it off the site.
Okay. Are citrus and olive trees pruned in a similar manner? And what season should I prune them?
I'm not familiar with citrus and
Olives.
olives, but we have a fruitless olive that still produces olives, and I prune that exactly the same as I prune everything else, mainly for shape and size. It
Yeah.
produces some fruit, but I'm not sure about the citrus. But I assume the pruning process would be the same for citrus.
And you can always go to the California Home Orchard UC website. It probably has that kind of information on it.
Yeah, I would. That's a good bet, Lisa.
And Karen has given fire blight info to someone. Okay, Nancy says, would you graft a tree at the elevation of the demo? When would you graft a tree at the elevation of the demo garden?
I would graft it probably in the probably the late winter,
Okay,
where it's just coming out of dormancy.
okay. If I
But
missed any,
you can probably graft it during its growing season too. You can probably graft it during like the late part of the summer, where it still has a 2 or 3 months of growth before it goes into dormancy.
okay.
But I would also refer to a grafting website on that too, because they'll probably give you, and it may depend on the type of tree too.
Okay. This is from the same question that had to do with the mandarin that was grafted on maybe a grapefruit. She wants to know, she said, the main part of the tree is not producing anything other than thorns. The graft is working, I believe, as it produced one mandarin last year. I want to encourage the mandarin. Can I cut back the main part of the tree?
I wouldn't do that, because you're gonna, if you ruin the health, cut the health back on the main part of the tree, the grafted part isn't going to grow very well either.
Oh, okay. And Michelle wants to know, what type of tree netting would you recommend for cherry trees, if you recommend any?
I just use regular bird netting. It's got the 1/2-inch squares in it.
Yeah.
I use that on my winter vegetable garden too, because all the brassicas and the leaf vegetables and everything, I have to keep the birds away from, or they'll devour them.
Well, yeah, it's my nightmare though. With my jewelry, I get caught on it all the time.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have one that says, how can you help a trunk with an opening in the trunk? The main stem has been cut off, but other branches are growing off the trunk and producing fruit. So you have an opening in the trunk.
An opening in the trunk,
Is it a diseased opening or a wound?
yeah. If it's an opening at all, if it's diseased, I would see if you could close it up by putting some material, in it, like you you would coat over a great big branch that you might cut off that you don't want water getting in.
What would some
No.
kind of sealant type of thing?
Yeah, they've got that black, it's almost like roofing tar type of stuff that you put across the branch. But if it's an opening that could get diseased, I would slather some of that, some of that branch cement in there, and then wrap it with a heavy cloth,
Okay,
just to try and keep disease out of it.
okay. This one says, I'm planning a home orchard. Do you have any tips for amending the clay soil and spacing and orientation before I start?
Well, the orientation, you'd like to get as much sun on it as you can. So a south or west facing slope or combination would be best. As far as spacing is concerned, I would keep, and it depends on the size of the trees. If you're going to keep the trees fairly small, like a semi-dwarf size, I would keep the spacing down to maybe 15 feet between them.
Okay,
If you're going standard size fruit trees, which are going to get bigger, I'd go out to 20 or 25 feet, probably 20 feet anyway.
any
And
any
the
tips
clay,
on amending clay soil?
I've got clay soils up on top of the ridge that we live on, and it's heavy clay. And I amend the soil when I plant the tree. And I
Right.
think between amending the soil, of course, the root systems are going to grow out of that soil fairly quickly, and into the clay soil. But with the water you give it and the fertilizer that you give it, say at least once a year, I wouldn't worry about amending the clay soil, because your roots are going to grow out of that clay soil really fast. And I amend the clay soil probably 50% with a healthier soil and compost when I plant the tree in the first place.
Okay. Let's see. I have an old apricot that has been producing scabbed fruit. Will it help to prune it way back?
I don't think so. I think that apricot's going to continue producing scab fruit, and I don't know what kind of scabs they're referring to, but our apricot, besides having a Utypa dieback on some branches, we also have a shot hole fungus problem with it. And I spray the apricot with the same spray I hit the peaches with to control peach leaf curl.
Okay.
And if I can get a good spray on the apricot periodically, that spray will probably tend to knock down that shot hole fungus. But I notice also this apricot, the shot hole fungus on the surface doesn't affect the fruit at all, and doesn't affect the taste of it. So I don't worry about it.
So we don't know what the scabbed fruit is for necessarily.
Yeah, I don't know what the scab is, but the shot hole fungus is like, it's got all these little
Yeah, I've seen that one.
little dots of, kind of reddish brown skin on the skin of the apricot itself.
Okay.
And we just leave it on there. In fact, we eat the apricots with that shot hole fungus on the skin, and it doesn't seem to affect the taste at all.
Okay. Do you prune cherry trees and pear the same?
I prune cherry trees much lighter than I do pears. Cherries, a lot of times apples and pears, the fruit's heavy enough that you have to be careful of not letting a lot of fruit grow on really thin branches. On the heavier pruning spurs, they'll hold the fruit fairly well, but you don't want to have a lot of fruiting spurs too close together because of the weight of the fruit. But cherry trees, the fruit's so light, I tend to let those get a little more involved and a little messier on the cherries, because the cherries, the weight of the cherries, the tree can take it. And
Right.
if you have a little thicker cherry tree, it's not going to bother it at all. You might get more fruit.
Okay, so I believe I've gotten to all the questions.
Okay. We wanted to talk for a little bit about, somebody had a question on bare roots.
Yeah, what a bare root is, but you didn't
Yeah.
really get to finish that description.
And the bare root typically is just a a stem and some roots coming off of it, and maybe a couple of branches coming off a stem. And basically, when we plant a bare root tree, we dig a hole that's, you know, probably a couple of feet in diameter and 1.5 to 2 feet deep. And when you plant the roots, you build a mound, kind of a mound of wet soil, damp soil. You moisten the hole real well before you plant it. Build a mound of damp soil in the bottom, right in the center of the hole. And you spread the root system out over that mound. So the root systems are going out from the fruit tree, out and down. And then once the fruit tree is planted and watered, take a look at the fruit tree. And if it's got some nice structural branches coming out of, you know, halfway up the tree, and they're reasonably close together and they're going out in different directions, it's nice to leave 3 to 5 structural branches on a new tree. And if that structural branches look good and it looks pretty symmetrical, you may only have to prune the tips of them and a little bit off the ends of the structural branches. However, sometimes some of these bare root trees don't have much in the way of structural branches, or they're deformed, or they're going off in, you know, way different directions, and it's not a very symmetrical looking tree. So in some cases like that, I've just taken the branches off the stalk and trim the branches off completely and plant the stalk. And as long as you have some good buds on that stalk, those buds will develop into branches. Excuse me. In cases like that, you'll just end up putting a bare root in and having a whip sticking up straight up with some good buds on it that develop into structural branches. And then the next year, you'll start growing some structural branches. And if those branches are going the direction that you want, out and up from the tree, that'll be great. Then you can start pruning those structural branches in the second and third year by trimming off right above the important buds to get those branches to branch off into the directions that you want. So bare roots can be kind of funky, but it's sometimes it's easy to make that decision if you plant them and they have good structural branches. But if they don't have good, healthy structural branches, the tough decision is to cut them all off and plant that stalk and then let the stalk grow.
I'm trying to read a question from Nancy Pikarzik, and I'm not sure what she means here. She says, I got the dieback like apricots on my cherries. So I think she wanted to say, do I prune them when it's, oh no, it says I daub them when it's warm now too. What does that mean, Nancy? Nancy, can you turn your microphone on?
She should be able to unmute herself.
If she's still here, I guess that might make the difference too.
Let me ask to unmute. Okay.
Are you there, Nancy?
She's still there.
Maybe she walked away for a minute.
That could
Read that question again, Lisa?
I was trying to make sense of it. It said that her apricot got her cherries got dieback like her apricot, and then she said something that I daub them when it's too warm now. I don't know what that means.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. There you go.
Okay, sorry. I was just trying to throw a comment out that I got that Utopia, is it called? Anyway, the dieback that you get on apricots on my cherries, because I didn't know not to do them in the winter. They aren't as susceptible, but they can get it around here.
Sure.
And I got it. So I don't do them in the winter anymore.
Just do it in the fall.
Yeah, it was a pest to get rid of. Also apriums.
Apriums.
You know,
I
the
don't
cross
know.
between apricot and plum.
Never heard of. You mean?
Never heard of an aprium?
No.
Tree?
I've heard of
Okay,
blue
well,
eye.
it's like a cross. Well, they have one that has more apricot in it.
Oh,
It's like 75% apricot and 25% plum.
Yeah.
Oh.
no,
Yeah.
I never heard of that.
Is popular. Anyway,
Or is that an relatively new?
no, it's been around a while.
No bark. Come on.
And also, if you're going to spray your apricot for the shot hole, because I have shot hole on mine and I did spray it, you have to kind of watch out and read the label on the copper stuff you use, because I think if it has sulfur and copper in it together, it will kill an apricot. Just make sure it says it's okay for apricots, the one you buy.
Yeah, and a lot of times on the spray, it won't say what fruits it's for either. It'll just say what it's generally for, but either that or put a lighter dose of it on.
Right.
Now
Yeah. I mean, you can kind of look it up somewhere. There's something that's really bad for apricots in a lot of the sprays that have copper.
Yeah.
And it's like sulfur something. Some kinds
Yeah.
of sulfur okay and some aren't. And I
Yeah.
can't tell you which because I don't have it memorized. I just,
Yeah.
usually the sprays have a leaflet
Yeah.
with them. If it doesn't say apricots on it, I wouldn't put it on an apricot.
Ah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Does anybody
Are you-
have mangoes?
I usually stay away from sulfur sprays anyway because there are a lot of trees that, don't like sulfur, or
Right,
if you do use sulfur, make sure it's a very low concentration.
right. It's just you
Yeah.
got to watch out because some of the ones that you use for peach leaf curl have that in it.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
If you're,
Yeah.
you
That's
just
a
got to
good
watch
thought.
out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good thought, Nancy. Yeah. Hey,
Okay.
on also your aprium you had, is that same thing as a pluot?
Well, I think a pluot's 25% apricot and 75% plum.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
an aprium is 75% apricot and 25%
Oh,
plum.
okay. Okay. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
they maybe didn't do as well or something, so you don't see them as often as the
Yeah.
as the pluots.
Well, next time I'm on one of those wholesale nursery websites, I'll have to look to see if they have them.
Okay, I have a few more questions. This one says, does anyone have mangoes and how are they doing? Okay. Mesh gloves can be purchased at large sporting goods stores that sell commercial fishing supplies. That's not a question. Okay, how do you know when to remove some of the apples? Coiling apple trees. No, I think she means, you mean when to thin your fruit is what I'm assuming.
If she's talking about thinning,
Yeah,
generally I try to thin the fruit probably in mid to late June, because oftentimes on a lot of fruit trees, you'll have a natural drop in late May to early June. And if you don't want a lot of drop, or if you still are desiring a big crop of fruit, let the drop hit first and then thin the rest of what might be, causing the branches to break,
bend.
or,
yeah.
I always take the fruit off the end of branches because that'll never work. They'll just bend over and either fall off or break the branch. But anyway, yeah, thinning has to be done, especially if you have a bumper crop.
Yeah, you're gonna lose branches.
Yeah. 2 years ago, when we had a bumper crop on this old apple, we went in and thinned. We had a normal drop in, late spring, early summer, but we went in after that and did a lot of thinning because there were an awful lot of branches that couldn't take the weight of the fruit. And generally, you don't want the fruit closer than maybe 6 or 8 inches to one another anyway, because it's going to make the tree too heavy. Then you have to start propping branches up with long sticks,
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Please discuss the use of little bags around individual fruits to protect from bird damage. Okay.
Yeah, you can do it, and apparently it works, and but it's
Okay.
awfully labor intensive.
That's what I was gonna say. It sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah, so it's whether a person wants to do that or not, you know, that's up to the orchard owner. You know, if you have
Okay,
a lot of, if you have a lot of fruit on the tree, and especially if it's a good sized tree and you got to get up on a ladder to do it, it's going to really be labor intensive. And the more you're on a ladder, the more dangerous it is anyway.
so I guess if you're younger and have a lot of time,
Yeah, yeah.
okay. This says, did we talk about when to prune cherry trees? I've read that possibility because of possibility of canker disease. This should happen late May or early June for the first pruning, and in August after the tree is finished fruiting. Is this true?
Yeah, I would do it in the fall, late summer or fall. Yeah. I typically prune my cherries the same time I prune everything else, unless I've got a disease problem. And then I'll prune the cherry trees earlier before they lose their leaves. But it's yeah, I'd say late summer, early fall.
Okay. And I think that's all I got so far. I was thanking Karen. She is a master gardener from El Dorado County that's been putting up links to the California Orchard website and stuff for us.
Oh, thank you. And then just to let everybody know, usually if you were at the open garden, at our open garden event, we would provide a couple of handouts on pruning. So what I can do, since everybody did register, which is great, I've got your email address and I can email you those handouts.
Yeah,
That's a great idea.
The handout that I refer to a lot, Debbie, is the one that was put together, researched and put together by Gary Fowler in 2007.
Okay.
And I think you've got it in your file, and
Yeah.
it's just titled Fruit Tree Pruning, and it's about well, originally he put it out as a handwritten form, but then he typed it up, and I think he's got it on Word, and it's about a 5-page document.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
and that's a really complete. It talks about the basics of it, and then it talks about all the different kinds of fruit trees and nut trees too, and the idiosyncrasies of each one.
We have a lot of excitement about getting the information in the emails, Debbie.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay, we'll do that. And if there isn't any more questions,
I see no more.
Okay, I want to thank everybody. I thank you for your patience and hanging in there. And I'm going to learn a few more security techniques. So the next time.
You did really well. I have to give you
Debbie,
that.
you did
better
great,
than the last time. Better than the last time it happened.
Yeah.
And I think Zoom actually has added some features too since the last time. I know they've increased their security, so it made it a little bit easier. But I want to thank everybody. This is great. And Al, thank you so much for your wonderful information. Lisa, thank you for all your help. And
somebody wants to know when the video will be posted.
I'm not sure yet, just because I'm going to have to do a little editing. And so that always takes time. So I just need to edit that Zoom bombing out a little bit. And, but I'll certainly email you and let you know when it is.
Okay. Somebody wanted to mention regarding security that they didn't need to enter the password to get into.
Oh.
I didn't either, so.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you for letting me know.
But they're telling you that you did a great job, and thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. Thank you.
Yep. Good work.
Okay.
Thanks,
all right, everybody.
See you later.
We'll see you next month. We'll be talking about grapes.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, great. Thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye now.